Ethan had lived on the remote planet of Dracara for many years, a quiet life away from the hustle of the cities and the noise of the more populated colonies. He was a rancher, used to the solitude and simplicity of his work. Each day, he tended to his crops and cared for the animals he raised. His little home sat in a small valley, surrounded by tall hills and thick forests. The planet was beautiful, but also harsh. The weather could change without warning, and the creatures that roamed the land were wild and unpredictable. One afternoon, as Ethan was walking through his fields, checking on his crops, he heard something in the distance. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then he heard it again, a low guttural growl. His instincts kicked in. He was used to the sounds of the animals on the planet. But this sound was different. It was too close, too powerful. Ethan slowly turned and walked toward the noise, his hand instinctively resting on the handle of the energy rifle he kept for protection. The growl grew louder, and soon Ethan saw a shape moving through the tall grass. It was large, at least the size of a bear, but its movement was smoother, more fluid. As he approached cautiously, he could make out more details. The creature had a sleek, muscular body covered in dark fur that seemed to shimmer with strange, glowing patterns. Its eyes were a deep green, almost like they were glowing too, but they seemed full of pain, fear, and confusion. Ethan hesitated. He'd seen many creatures on Dracara, but this one was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Most of the creatures here were wild and aggressive, attacking without warning, but this one seemed different. It was hurt, dragging its body through the grass as though it couldn't walk properly. Something about it made Ethan's heart ache. "Hey there," he called out softly, keeping a safe distance. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The creature froze, its head turning toward him slowly. Its breathing was heavy, and Ethan could see it was struggling. There was something almost human in its gaze. The growl that had been coming from it stopped, replaced by a low whimper. Ethan could feel a strong pull to help, even though his mind screamed at him to stay cautious. There was always a risk when dealing with unknown creatures, especially those as large and dangerous as this one. But he couldn't bring himself to leave it like this. The creature looked so vulnerable, and despite its intimidating appearance, Ethan could see that it wasn't looking to attack him. Slowly, he crouched down, trying to make himself seem smaller, less threatening. "Don't worry. I'll help you," Ethan said gently, keeping his voice calm. He reached out carefully with one hand, unsure whether the creature would trust him. To his surprise, it didn't pull away. Instead, it let out a soft, low sound like a sigh, and it took a slow, cautious step forward. Ethan knew he had to be careful. He had heard stories of strange, dangerous creatures on Dracara, and he wasn't foolish enough to trust anything right away. But there was something about this one that made him feel it wasn't a threat. With the creature close enough now, Ethan carefully inspected its injury. It had a deep gash across its side, blood oozing from the wound. Ethan's heart sank. It looked like it had been through a fight, and the creature was clearly exhausted. He knew he had to do something to help. He turned back toward his house, glancing nervously over his shoulder at the creature. "I'm going to get some supplies. Don't go anywhere," he said. Ethan hurried back to his house, grabbing a first aid kit and some fresh bandages. As he returned to the creature, he saw that it had not moved. It seemed to trust him, or perhaps it was just too weak to go anywhere. He knelt beside it, slowly reaching for the gash. The creature flinched at first, but then it relaxed as Ethan gently cleaned the wound. "It's all right. I won't hurt you," he said softly, trying to comfort it. His hands worked quickly and efficiently, even though he felt a strange unease at handling such a creature. As he finished bandaging the wound, Ethan looked into the creature's eyes again. There was something almost intelligent in its gaze now. The glowing green eyes studied him with what seemed like curiosity, as though it was trying to understand him. Ethan's heart softened. "I think you're going to be okay," Ethan said quietly, standing up. The creature, although still weak, gave a low whimper and nudged his hand with its nose. Ethan smiled. It was a small gesture, but it made him feel as though he had done the right thing. He stood there for a moment, watching the creature carefully. It was clear it wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. Ethan could only guess what had happened to it, what kind of life it had lived before coming to him. "Rest up," Ethan said softly, turning away to go back to his work. "I'll check on you later." But as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much bigger. There was something special about this creature, something different, and Ethan couldn't help but wonder what secrets it was hiding. Little did he know, the creature's true nature was about to reveal itself in ways he could never have imagined. The next day, Ethan returned to the spot where he had found the strange creature, eager to check on its condition. He had spent the night thinking about it, wondering what kind of creature he had encountered. He had never seen anything like it before on Drakara, and though it had looked fierce at first, he now felt a strange sense of connection to it. The glowing patterns on its fur, the intelligence in its eyes, it was unlike anything he had ever known. As he reached the clearing where the creature had been resting, he was surprised to find that it was no longer lying down. Instead, it was standing on its legs, its body slightly hunched, its eyes locked on him. It looked almost regal, and for a moment, Ethan felt a sense of awe. The creature didn't appear to be in as much pain anymore, though it was still moving cautiously, as if it wasn't fully recovered. "Hey there," Ethan called softly, stepping closer. "How are you feeling today?" The creature didn't answer, of course, but Ethan noticed that it didn't seem as fearful of him anymore. It studied him, its glowing green eyes never leaving his face. There was something almost human in the way it watched him, as if it was trying to understand him, just as much as he was trying to understand it. He slowly crouched down, keeping his distance but reaching out his hand in a gesture of peace. "I'm glad you're feeling better," he said quietly, his voice gentle. To his surprise, the creature took a step toward him, and then another, its movements slow but deliberate. It stopped just a few feet away, and Ethan could see that the wound he had treated the day before was healing well. The bandages were still in place, but the edges of the injury had already begun to close. As Ethan watched, something strange began to happen. The creature's fur began to shimmer and glow more intensely. At first it was just a soft flicker, but then the glow became brighter, almost blinding. Ethan squinted, confused by what was happening. Was it some sort of defense mechanism? Was the creature preparing to attack? But before Ethan could react, the shimmering light exploded outward, enveloping the creature in a dazzling glow. Ethan stepped back instinctively, raising his hand to shield his eyes from the intense brightness. When the light faded, he blinked in surprise. What he saw in front of him was no longer the injured animal he had helped just the day before. Instead, standing before him was a tall, elegant woman. She was humanoid, but unlike any human Ethan had ever seen. Her skin was smooth and glowing, with a faint shimmer that reflected the light in a way that made her seem almost otherworldly. Her eyes were still the same deep, glowing green, but now they looked even more intelligent, almost as if they could see straight through him. Her hair cascaded down in waves of silver, catching the light as it moved. She wore no clothes, but her body was covered in glowing patterns that seemed to pulse softly, almost as if they were alive. Ethan stood frozen, his heart racing. He had never seen anything like this. The creature he had helped was no longer a strange, wild animal. It was a gorgeous alien woman, one who looked both delicate and powerful, mysterious and beautiful. But most of all, she looked vulnerable, as if she didn't quite know where she was or what to do next. The woman blinked at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and curiosity. She took a hesitant step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the ground. She seemed to be studying him just as much as he was studying her. Ethan opened his mouth to say something, but words failed him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The alien woman raised a hand slowly, as if she was unsure whether it was safe to move too quickly. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft and melodic, though it had a tone of uncertainty. Who are you?" she asked, her voice trembling just slightly. Ethan finally managed to gather his thoughts, though his voice came out in a whisper. I'm Ethan. I found you yesterday. You were hurt, and I helped you." He couldn't take his eyes off her, still trying to understand what had just happened. Was this some sort of strange dream? Had he lost his mind? The woman nodded, her eyes scanning him as if trying to understand his words. I am Zara," she said slowly, her accent strange but clear. I'm not from here. I was hiding. I am not an animal." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You're not. But you were. I mean, you looked like." Zara smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. "I know," she said. "I had to hide. I didn't want to draw attention. But you showed me mercy. I didn't expect that. Not from humans." Ethan's heart sank as he processed her words. "Mercy," he repeated. "What do you mean?" "I just helped you because you were hurt." Zara's expression softened, and she lowered her gaze. "My people, we have been hiding for so long. I didn't think anyone would show me kindness. But you did." Her voice trailed off, filled with a deep, unspoken pain. Ethan's mind was racing. The creature he had helped was an alien, a beautiful, intelligent being from another world. And yet, somehow, he had treated her like any other creature in need of help. He realized that his actions had unknowingly made all the difference. "You're not alone," Ethan said softly, his voice full of determination. "I'll help you, whatever you need." Zara looked up at him, her eyes full of gratitude and a hint of hope. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. "I don't know what to do now, but I will never forget this." Ethan nodded, feeling a deep sense of connection with her. Little did he know, this was only the beginning of a journey that would change everything, for both of them. The days that followed were filled with questions and discoveries. Ethan and Zara spent most of their time together, and Ethan quickly learned that Zara's world was far more complicated than he had ever imagined. She wasn't just any alien. She was from a distant planet, a place far beyond Drakara. Her people, the Elorians, were a peaceful race, but they had been hunted and oppressed by a much more powerful species. Zara had been on the run for years, hiding in the forests of Drakara to escape capture. As they sat together one afternoon, Zara told Ethan more about her past. The two of them sat on a large rock by a stream, the gentle sound of the flowing water making the air feel calmer. "My people were once rulers of many worlds," Zara explained, her voice soft but filled with sadness. "We were peaceful but powerful. We never sought war. But the Zorvax, a brutal race, attacked us. They wanted to control everything, to conquer us. We lost many of our people, and I was forced to flee." Ethan listened intently, his heart aching for her. He couldn't imagine the pain and fear she had experienced. The idea of being hunted, of having to run for your life every day, was unimaginable to him. Yet, Zara spoke of it like it was something that had become part of her, something she had accepted, though not without sorrow. "They're ruthless," Zara continued, her eyes distant as she looked at the stream. "They've wiped out entire civilizations, and they would stop at nothing to find me. I am a fugitive now, hiding on a planet where I don't belong." Ethan shook his head, his heart heavy with sympathy. "That's not right," he said firmly. "No one should have to live like that." Zara smiled faintly, her glowing green eyes locking onto his. "And yet, I have been hiding, waiting, hoping that one day I would find a place where I could be free. But I didn't expect to find someone like you." Ethan felt a warmth spread through his chest. "I don't care where you're from," he said with a sincere smile. "You're safe here. I'll do whatever I can to help you." Zara seemed to brighten at his words, but a shadow of doubt still lingered in her eyes. "But you don't understand," she said. shaking her head. The Zorvax will not stop. They have resources beyond your world's imagination. They can track me anywhere, and they have soldiers who are not easily defeated. Even if you want to help, there is nothing you can do to protect me." Ethan's expression hardened. "Don't say that. I've helped you once, and I'll help you again. You don't have to face this alone." Zora was silent for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the water, as if contemplating his words. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been running for so long. I'm afraid that even your kindness might not be enough to save me. The Zorvax will come, Ethan. They will come for me, and they will destroy everything in their path, even you." The weight of her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Ethan wasn't sure what to say. The idea of such an invasion, of such a powerful enemy, seemed impossible. How could one person, even a person as determined as him, stand against such a threat? But deep down, Ethan knew something. He couldn't just sit by and watch her suffer. He had already made a promise to himself and to her, that he would protect her. He would not let her face the Zorvax alone. "We'll figure it out," Ethan said with more confidence than he felt. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you. There has to be a way to fight back." Zora looked at him, her eyes wide with a mix of wonder and uncertainty. "You really believe that?" she asked, her voice full of disbelief. Ethan nodded, his expression determined. "I do. We'll find a way. I've lived on this planet long enough to know it has resources, weapons, and people who can help. We're not powerless." Zora seemed to consider his words, the hope in her eyes flickering once again. You might be right," she said slowly. "But even if we can find a way to fight back, it won't be easy. The Zorvax will stop at nothing." Ethan stood up, offering her his hand. "Then we'll make it our mission to stop them, together." Zara hesitated for a moment, and then she took his hand, standing beside him. For the first time since they had met, she looked like she might truly believe that they had a chance. There was a fire in her eyes, a spark of hope that hadn't been there before. "I don't know what the future holds," Zara said softly. "But I believe in you, Ethan. And for the first time in years, I'm willing to hope again." Ethan gave her a reassuring smile, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and determination. "We'll figure this out. I promise." As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden light over the land, the two of them stood together, staring at the horizon. There was still much to do, and they knew the road ahead would be difficult. But for the first time, they both felt like they weren't alone in the fight. The Zorvax might be powerful, but Ethan was certain of one thing. They hadn't counted on human ingenuity, and with Zara by his side, he knew they had a chance. Maybe a slim one, but a chance nonetheless. They would fight, no matter the odds, and they would fight together. The sun had barely risen the next morning, casting a soft glow across the land. Ethan and Zara stood at the edge of the small farm, looking out over the vast fields that stretched as far as the eye could see. A new day had begun, but the weight of the upcoming battle still hung heavily in the air. "We need a plan," Ethan said, breaking the silence that had settled between them. "The Zorvax are coming, and we need to be ready." Zara nodded, her eyes narrowing in determination. "You're right, but we can't just wait for them to show up. We need to be proactive. We need to find a way to defend ourselves." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You're not planning to run again, are you?" Zara shook her head, her expression hardening. "No. I've been running for years, Ethan. I'm done hiding. If we want a chance to survive, we need to fight back. I've learned some things over the years, and there may be a way to stand up to the Zorvax. But it won't be easy." Ethan met her gaze, his resolve strengthening. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes. We can't let them destroy everything we care about." Zara studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge the depth of his commitment. Finally, she nodded. "All right. First, we need to find a place where we can plan in safety." Somewhere the Zorvax won't immediately find. Ethan thought for a moment. Then his face lit up. There's an old cabin on the edge of the forest. It's been abandoned for years. We can use it as our base. Perfect, Zara replied. We'll need to move quickly. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. The Zorvax are ruthless, and they have the resources to track me down. We'll need to be smart. Ethan turned and looked back at the farm. The quiet life he had always known now seemed like a distant memory. His days of farming, of simple routines, were over. But as he looked at Zara, he realized there was no going back. He couldn't just let her face the Zorvax alone. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined, and he was going to fight for her, for both of them. We'll leave at sunset, Ethan said. That way, we can move without drawing attention. We'll need to pack supplies, too. Zora nodded in agreement. I'll make sure we have everything we need. We'll need food, water, and anything that might help us in case we have to defend ourselves. But remember, our main goal is to stay hidden. If we can't fight the Zorvax head-on, then we need to outsmart them. As the day wore on, they moved quickly to prepare. Ethan packed supplies in his old backpack, while Zara made sure to gather anything she thought might be useful: tools, medical supplies, and some strange, advanced devices she had kept hidden for emergencies. Ethan was amazed at the things she had, things that seemed like they were straight out of a science fiction movie. But he didn't question it. They were going to need every advantage they could get. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the two of them were ready. They took one last look at the farm, the place that had been Ethan's home for so long. There was no time to be sentimental, though. This wasn't the life he had imagined for himself, but it was the life he had now, and he would protect it. Protect Zara, at all costs. The journey to the cabin was long and tense, but they moved quietly, sticking to the shadows whenever possible. Zara led the way, her keen senses guiding them through the dense forest. Ethan followed closely behind, keeping his eyes peeled for any signs of danger. Every crack of a twig, every rustling leaf sent a jolt of fear through him, but he didn't voice his concerns. Zara was strong, and they had to trust in their plan. As they reached the cabin, Zara gave a soft sigh of relief. The small wooden building looked as abandoned as ever, with vines creeping up the sides and the roof in need of repair. But it was perfect for their purposes. They could hide here, plan, and gather their strength. Zara quickly scanned the area, ensuring they hadn't been followed. Satisfied, she motioned for Ethan to follow her inside. The cabin was dimly lit, with only a few rays of light breaking through the cracks in the walls. It was old but sturdy, and that was all that mattered. "All right," Zara said, setting her pack down. "This will be our base of operations. We need to make it secure and set up communication systems so we can stay in contact with anyone who might be able to help us." Ethan nodded. "We can use the old radio in the shed. It's not much, but it works." "Good," Zara said, her tone determined. "We'll need all the help we can get." They spent the rest of the night securing the cabin and setting up their equipment. Every noise outside made Ethan tense, but each time it turned out to be nothing more than the wind or a stray animal. As the hours passed, the two of them worked in silence, the weight of their mission settling over them. As the night grew darker, Zara turned to Ethan. "We'll start making contact tomorrow. We need to be prepared. The Zorvax won't wait forever." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with resolve. "We're ready." And so, in the quiet of that old cabin, far from the world they had once known, their plan began to take shape. The fight was far from over, but now, with hope and determination on their side, they would face whatever came their way, together. The morning sun filtered through the gaps in the cabin walls, casting long, narrow beams of light across the floor. Ethan had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of the Zorvax and the uncertain future ahead. Beside him, Zora had already woken, silently preparing herself for the day ahead. She moved with a quiet efficiency that seemed to make the space feel smaller, as though the weight of what they were about to do was pressing in on them. "Are you ready?" Zara asked, her voice calm, but there was a sharpness to it that spoke of determination. Ethan nodded, though he didn't feel completely ready. How could he? They were about to take on an enemy far stronger and better equipped than anything they had ever faced, but there was no other choice. "Let's do this." Zara's eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, they just stood there. There was a sense of understanding between them. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about something bigger. It was about fighting for the future, for the life they both wanted to build. "We need to contact the Resistance," Zara said, breaking the silence. "They're our best chance of getting the Zorvax off our backs for good." Ethan felt a pang of unease. The Resistance was a group of rebels who had been fighting the Zorvax for years, but they were scattered, hard to find, and hard to trust. The idea of depending on them was a gamble, but it was their best shot. "Where do we start?" he asked. Zara turned to the old radio in the corner of the cabin, its cracked surface and worn wires a testament to years of neglect. It had been a long time since anyone had used it regularly, but Zara was confident it still worked. She approached it with the care of someone handling a fragile object, brushing dust off the knobs before flicking the switch. The low hum of static filled the air as the machine came to life. Zara adjusted the dials, her brow furrowed in concentration. She had learned the art of communication through the old frequencies over the years, a skill she had picked up in her travels. She knew how to reach the Resistance, but she also knew the risks. Ethan watched her, a mixture of admiration and fear in his heart. What if they were too late? What if the Zorvax had already found their trail? What if everything they had fought for so far had been in vain? "Got it," Zara said, breaking through his thoughts. She straightened up, her eyes scanning the dial. "I've got a clear connection. Now we just need to send out the signal." Taking a deep breath, she spoke into the radio. "This is Zara. We need help. The Zorvax are after us. We're on the move. Please respond." For a few moments, there was nothing but the crackling sound of static. Then, a voice came through, faint but unmistakable. "Zara, we read you. This is Resistance Command. You've been off our radar for a while. What's going on?" Zara's eyes brightened with relief. "I have information on the Zorvax's movements. I can help you plan your next move, but I need backup. They're closing in on us, and we're not prepared to fight them off alone." There was a long pause before the voice on the other end replied. "We understand. We'll send a team to your location, but you need to hold out as long as you can. Don't make any unnecessary moves. The Zorvax are hunting for you, and they're not going to stop." Zara's face darkened, but she nodded. "Understood. We'll wait." The transmission ended, and the cabin fell silent once again. Ethan let out the breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The Resistance was on their way, but it would take time. Time they didn't have much of. "We need to prepare," Zara said, breaking the silence. "We don't know when they'll arrive, but we need to be ready." Ethan nodded, already scanning the small cabin for anything they could use. They had a few supplies, but it wouldn't be enough to face the Zorvax head-on. They needed more. "Do you have any weapons? Anything that can help us defend ourselves?" Zara hesitated for a moment before nodding. She pulled out a small, sleek device from her pack and handed it to him. "This is a pulse blaster. It's not much, but it can give us a fighting chance if the Zorvax find us before the Resistance arrives." Ethan took the device, his fingers brushing over the cold metal. It looked like something out of a science fiction movie, but he knew better than to underestimate it. In their world, anything that could give them an edge was worth having. "We should hide," Zara suggested. "If the Zorvax get close, we don't want to be caught off guard." They quickly moved to the back of the cabin, where a small trapdoor led to a hidden basement. It was an old storage space, filled with remnants of a life long gone, but it would provide the cover they needed. They descended into the darkness, the only light coming from the faint glow of the radio on the floor above them. Zara sat down on a crate, her eyes scanning the room. Ethan stood near the door, his hand on the blaster, ready for anything. The quiet tension was unbearable. They had done everything they could to prepare. Now, all they could do was wait. Hours passed, each minute dragging on as the fear of discovery loomed closer. Every noise outside made Ethan's heart race. He couldn't help but imagine what would happen if the Zorvax arrived before help came. But Zara remained calm, her gaze steady, as if she had lived with this constant threat for a lifetime. Finally, just as the sun began to set, a new transmission crackled through the radio. "We're close," came the voice. "Get ready. We'll be there soon." Ethan exhaled in relief. Help was on the way. But even with the resistance close by, the real battle was about to begin. The air was thick with tension as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. Ethan and Zara sat in the small hidden basement, the dim light from the radio flickering in the silence. Hours had passed since the resistance had promised to arrive. Every minute felt like a year as the weight of the situation pressed heavily on both of them. "Do you think they'll make it?" Ethan asked, his voice quiet but filled with concern. Zara glanced up at him, her face expressionless, though her eyes held a deep concern of their own. "I don't know. But we have no choice but to trust them." Her words were steady, but her hands were clenched in her lap. They were on the edge now. There was no turning back. The distant rumble of engines interrupted the quiet, and both of them stood at once, their senses immediately heightened. Zara moved quickly to the radio, her fingers adjusting the dials. A crackling voice came through. "This is Resistance Command. We're in position. ETA, 5 minutes. Stay hidden. We'll handle the Zorvax when we arrive." Zara gave a quick nod, as if the voice could see her. "Understood. We'll stay put." Ethan swallowed hard, trying to calm his racing heartbeat. 5 minutes. It didn't feel like nearly enough time. They weren't prepared for what was coming, but they had to be ready. They had to survive. "Ready your weapon," Zara whispered, her tone more serious than ever before. Ethan nodded and gripped the pulse blaster tightly. The small weapon felt heavy in his hand, but he knew it would be their only hope if things went south before reinforcements arrived. He had never been in a battle like this before, and the thought of facing the Zorvax was terrifying. But Zara's calm confidence gave him some strength. If she could face this, so could he. Moments later, the unmistakable sound of boots crunching on gravel echoed outside the cabin. They had arrived, but there was something wrong. The footsteps were too many, too heavy. "Zar, do you hear that?" Ethan whispered, his voice tight with fear. Zara stood at the trapdoor, listening intently. "I hear it," she murmured. "Something's off." The noise outside grew louder, and the distinct sound of metallic clanking reached their ears. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. The Zorvax weren't just close. They were already here. "They're here," Zara said, her voice calm, but with a new edge of urgency. "We don't have time. We need to act now." Without another word, she grabbed the radio, sending out one final transmission. "Resistance, they've found us. We need backup, now." She quickly turned to Ethan, her eyes sharp with determination. "We fight, but we fight smart. We can't take them head-on. We need to use the terrain." Ethan nodded, trying to ignore the adrenaline flooding through his veins. Zara was right. Their best chance was to outsmart the Zorvax, not try to overpower them. They crept toward the cabin door, which led to the small yard outside. The moment Ethan stepped outside, he saw the Zorvax soldiers. Their large, imposing figures were unmistakable. They were clad in armor that shimmered darkly in the fading light, their faces obscured by helmets. The Zorvax were a terrifying sight, and just the thought of going up against them made his stomach twist. "Stay low," Zara whispered, her voice barely audible. She crouched down and moved silently toward the edge of the cabin. using the cover of trees to stay hidden. Ethan followed, doing his best to keep his breathing steady and his steps light. The Zorvax hadn't noticed them yet, but it was only a matter of time before they would. They needed to move quickly. They made their way to a small outbuilding near the woods. Zora peered around the corner, her sharp eyes scanning the area. "There's a way out through the back," she said, pointing to a small path that led deeper into the forest. "We can slip through there if we're quick enough." Ethan nodded, but his eyes kept drifting back to the Zorvax soldiers who were patrolling the yard. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get out of sight, but he knew they couldn't just retreat. Not now. Zora was already moving again, leading the way along the narrow path through the trees. Ethan followed closely behind, keeping his weapon ready in case the Zorvax came too close. The forest around them was eerily quiet, the tension of the moment hanging heavily in the air. Suddenly, the unmistakable sound of voices reached them. The Zorvax were getting closer. Their search had intensified. "Over there," one of them shouted, and the unmistakable click of their weapons charging filled the air. Ethan's heart raced. They were running out of time. "Get down," Zora hissed, pulling him into a crouch behind a thick tree trunk. They held their breath, listening as the Zorvax moved past them, their heavy footsteps almost vibrating the ground beneath them. When the last of the soldiers had passed, Zora glanced at Ethan. "We need to keep moving. We're almost there." They hurried forward, now closer to the edge of the forest. The resistance had promised to help, but they hadn't arrived yet. Time was running out, and the danger was closing in. Every moment felt like it could be their last. As they neared the edge of the trees, Zora's eyes scanned the horizon. There, just visible through the branches, was the faint outline of something moving, something that didn't belong to the Zorvax. A flash of hope surged within Ethan's chest. "They're here," Zora said quietly, her face filled with a quiet relief. "The resistance is here." But the battle was far from over. They still had to survive the next few moments. The sound of heavy footsteps reverberated through the trees, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. The Zorvax were getting closer. With every step, the weight of the situation grew heavier. They had to make a stand, now or never. But where were the resistance? The seconds felt like hours, and the urgency of their mission pressed down on them like a suffocating weight. Zora moved swiftly and silently, her sharp eyes scanning the horizon. Ethan kept close, doing his best to stay hidden behind the thick trunks of the trees. The forest, which had felt like a sanctuary moments ago, now felt like a trap. Every rustling leaf and distant snap of a twig made his heart race. "They're close," Zora whispered. Her voice was steady, but Ethan could hear the tension beneath her calm exterior. "We can't afford to wait any longer." Ethan nodded. The resistance would arrive when they could, but it was up to them to hold their ground. He gripped his pulse blaster tighter, trying to focus on the task at hand. Suddenly, a crackling sound came through the air, and the faint shape of a vehicle appeared through the trees. It was the resistance. Hope flared in Ethan's chest. They weren't alone anymore. But the joy was short-lived. In the distance, another group of Zorvax soldiers appeared. Their heavy armor and intimidating figures blocked the path between Ethan, Zora, and the approaching help. The resistance had arrived, but they were caught in a deadly crossfire. Ethan's mind raced. There was no time to waste. They had to act. "Zora, we need to move. Now," Ethan hissed. "We can't stay hidden forever." Zora looked at him, her face set in a hard expression. She nodded, then took a deep breath. "Stay close. We fight, and we fight smart. We take them down one by one." With that, Zora led the way, her steps swift and silent as she made her way to the left. Staying low behind the thick bushes, Ethan followed closely behind, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He couldn't afford to hesitate now. The first Zorvax soldier came into view, moving toward the resistance with his rifle raised. Before he could make a move, Zora jumped from the shadows, catching him off guard. With one swift, well-placed strike, she disarmed him and brought him to the ground in a matter of seconds. Ethan followed her lead, using the element of surprise to his advantage. He swung his pulse blaster up and fired, sending a shot straight into the chest of the nearest Zorvax. The alien soldier crumpled to the ground, but the battle wasn't over. More Zorvax soldiers were coming, more of them than Ethan had expected. "Fall back," Zora shouted as she fired another shot, knocking one of the soldiers off his feet. "We need to regroup with the resistance." Ethan didn't need any more encouragement. They sprinted toward the resistance's position, dodging enemy fire and using the trees for cover. The sound of blasters firing and explosions filled the air as the battle erupted around them. It was chaos, utter, unrelenting chaos. Finally, they'd reached the resistance soldiers. Ethan saw the familiar faces of their allies, including the resistance leader, Commander Thorne. His eyes locked onto Zara and Ethan, and he gave a grim nod. "We'll hold them off here. You two need to make it to the extraction point." Ethan nodded, trying to steady his breath. The resistance had arrived in full force, but they still had a long fight ahead. The Zorvax soldiers were relentless, their numbers seemingly endless. "Where's the extraction point?" Zara asked, her eyes scanning the battlefield. Thorne pointed toward a narrow path through the trees, barely visible through the smoke and chaos. "That way. We'll cover you, but you have to move quickly." Without another word, Zora grabbed Ethan's arm, and they started moving toward the extraction point. Every step was a risk, but they didn't have time to hesitate. The resistance had bought them a chance, and they had to take it. But just as they were about to reach the path, a loud explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The blast sent them both sprawling to the dirt, and Ethan barely managed to keep his grip on his blaster. "Get up," Zora shouted, pulling him to his feet. "We can't stop now." Ethan nodded, his head spinning from the explosion. He didn't have time to dwell on it. They had to keep going. They had to survive. Together, they ran toward the narrow path, the sounds of battle growing distant behind them. The smoke from the explosions hung heavy in the air, making it harder to see. But they kept pushing forward, their hearts pounding in their chests. They couldn't stop. Not now. Finally, they reached the extraction point. A sleek, armored vehicle waited for them, its engines humming quietly in the background. "We made it," Ethan gasped, relief flooding through him. They weren't out of danger yet, but they had made it this far. Zora gave him a tight smile, but her eyes remained focused. "We're not safe yet. Get in." As they climbed into the vehicle, the doors slammed shut behind them. The vehicle's engines roared to life, and they shot into the sky, leaving the chaos below. Ethan watched as the battle faded into the distance. His heart was still racing, but for the first time in hours, he felt a small sense of relief. They had survived. But as the stars filled the sky above them, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Zorvax were out there, and they would not stop until they had everything they wanted. The fight wasn't over, and humanity's survival depended on what they did next.